Stephen Jolley, veteran community broadcaster, RPH Australia and Vision Australia Radio. In conversation with Beck Pascalini, RPH Australia.
Well, Stephen, we've chatted a bit about your work at Vision Australia Radio, but you haven't only helped to develop radio services for people with a print disability. You were really instrumental in development and funding policy through your work with the Australian Council for Radio for the Print Handicapped.
Yep.
Which then became RPH Australia. Is that correct?
That's right.
So could you tell us a little bit about, so you're a founding board member of the...
Yes, I was. And for two periods of time I was chair of RPH Australia, one time in the early 80s and another time in the 90s. What was happening around the late 70s is that there were some of us in Victoria, a group in New South Wales led by a blind lady named Barbara Blackman, and also Professor Neil Runcie, who was one of the pioneers of community radio in New South Wales. He had a lot to do with 2MBS, and then came across, and once he got that going, took an interest in developing radio reading services. So there was New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and interest starting to come from other places, from Queensland, etc. South Australia and Western Australia were a little later, but we realised that we had to collaborate, and that was our best way of achieving our objectives. So we formed this council for Radio for the Print Handicapped, which was a cooperative, and we worked through the 1980s for copyright reform, so that our broadcasters could broadcast any content available in print without having to get permission to do so beforehand. Mind you, as a courtesy, we would communicate with the publishers, say the newspapers, and say, we'd like to read your material on our radio service, and always got good support for that. But it needed to be formalised in some way, so that someone couldn't ping you for reading a newspaper article that they hadn't given permission for. And so there was a major change to the Copyright Act for that, for radio, for the print handicapped, as it was described. Another major one was getting some kind of consistent funding to help the RPH services. So we got government funding. This was in the days before the Community Broadcasting Foundation. And it was an initiative from Malcolm Fraser in 1981, which was IYDP, International Year of Disabled People, that sort of kicked that off, really. And then later on we worked towards really it was sort of like the maturing of the RPH services, bringing them into a new age of operating not just off the end of the AM band, but with mainstream frequencies alongside other radio services. And that happened around 1990. Now, that couldn't have happened without the cooperation and the collaboration, really, of the various state broadcasters. And when we did operate in a united way like that, well, we got good help from governments of both sides. As I mentioned, the Fraser government. Gareth Evans was very supportive, particularly with the Metropolitan Radio Plan, as it was described, right, which involved taking allowing some AM broadcasters to move to FM, and then using the frequencies that were then available for services like the Parliamentary Broadcast Service and the RPH service. So we were very fortunate to be given that special treatment when you think of, you know, the jungle of community broadcasting.
Yes.
And for us to be recognised as a network who could benefit from that transition to the AM band.
And to receive that, as you say, bipartisan support for such a long time. But you got in on the other side, didn't you? You got involved with the Community Broadcasting Foundation to work on grants advisory committees and other advisory committees.
Yes, I did.
To help support not only our sector but the broader community radio sector.
Yeah, that was important for me to be able to play a part in the broader aspects of community radio. It was able to enable me to sort of bring context back to my RPH colleagues, and it was a good time. Met and worked with lots of good people, and I think was able to, as well as perhaps contribute a little bit to broader community radio, but certainly make a difference for our profile in community radio. And you know, a few doors were opened up, renewed links with Tony Staley, who was the chair of the Community Broadcasting Foundation for a number of years in the early 90s.
Was that, you were on the board, you did two stints on the board, didn't you? But I love that also that you brought that, the perspective from our radio reading sector to other developments like training for community broadcasters and the online and digital developments as well.
Yes, well, it's very important to do that. It's one of the problems with human behaviour these days is we tend to operate in silos, and we could have easily resisted moving to the CBF and having them manage the funding that was earmarked for RPH. But it wouldn't have, in the long run, it wouldn't have been very good because we then wouldn't have had those extra sort of links into broader community. People in community radio wouldn't have understood what RPH is, and it would have just been seen as that sort of separate thing that operates off the side. And for some it might still seem like that because we all think of the different sectors different ways, but it was certainly for the greater good of RPH and hopefully for community radio in general, for RPH to be a part of the CBF and to participate more in CBAA activities as well.
And with the other peak bodies, I'm sure too, the National Ethnic and Multicultural Broadcasters Council and various Indigenous peak bodies as well. Yeah,
that's true. In various ways.
Well, I think that's all the historical questions that I had, Stephen. Was there anything else you wanted to tell us, before we moved on to some questions that would be more aimed at stations or at blind producers? Is there anything you wanted to tell us about your history in our sector? Or
I think the only thing is that I'd like to add is that it's a philosophy that I have which helps drive my thinking, and for the suckers who have had to listen to me can influence their thinking. And that is that we shouldn't lose track at any time of what our objective is. And in the case of the RPH movement, it's about enabling people with a print disability, and we haven't discussed the wider print disability community very much here, but there are a lot of other people apart from people who can't see very well, who can't read because of learning difficulty, some other cognitive disadvantage that they have, language, all sorts of various reasons. You know, a lot of people with dyslexia use the radio service. So it is broader than the blindness and low vision community, though it's true we were probably the initiators and the drivers of it in the early days. But anyway, my approach is we must never lose sight of what we are trying to achieve, and that's to enable people to have access to information. So if AM radio was dead tomorrow, I wouldn't lose any sleep over that, as long as what was in its place was serving that objective of enabling people to gain access to content. And I think that movements sort of damage themselves sometimes by clinging on to, oh well, that's the way we've always done it, rather than look at in this time in our history, what is the best way to do or to achieve what we want to achieve. So I'm excited by online technologies. I'm excited by even things like the G5 technology that'll be around in a few years' time. That'll mean more data will probably be able to be provided and more conveniently. I'm excited that my iPhone is my 21st century transistor radio, and I can go anywhere and have the same access as long as it has connection to the network. I have the same access to radio and podcasts and heaps of content, no matter where I am. And I think we must celebrate that and take great advantage of it, and not cling on to, oh well, we're radio people and you've got to keep radio going.
So is that part of your vision for the future of RPH, that it branches to the digital world?
Well, it's already branching to the digital world. It broadcasts on digital radio, it streams, there is some podcasting, so it's happening sort of very, very gradually, but moving forward. I think the time is going to come when we won't think about how the content is reaching us, because we can just say to our Google device, hey, G-O-O-G-L-E, play a particular station. Even now people don't realise that's streaming it. They just think it's putting the radio on in a fancy way.
Yes.
And that happens more and more, like with Sonos and other services where people are streaming and they don't realise they're doing it. And I think that's going to happen more and more.
Produced for RPH Australia and the Ability Radio Project, 4ZZZ FM.